Welcome to Renegade Inc., the show that allows us to think differently. It was the screenwriter Blake Schneider who said that screenplays are Swiss clocks of emotion. We've all felt that pull when cinema openly manipulates us to root for the good guy fighting injustice. But what effect on society can screenwriters have if their work is being influenced by institutions that push a government narrative? Could that Swiss clock of emotion be used nefariously to further geopolitical agendas, or is that just conspiracy theory from cloud cuckoo land? Joining me to discuss how Hollywood is influenced, and more importantly, how we're influenced by it, is the author of Real Power, Hollywood Cinema and American Supremacy, Dr. Matthew Alford. Matthew, welcome. When you go and watch a film, when an audience goes and watch a film, it's a bit of escapism. We don't look too deeply into it, but the point is that Hollywood is controlled in a sense. The messages coming out of Hollywood are controlled. Without being conspiracy theorists or, barking loonies, how much of what comes out of Hollywood is managed, is controlled?
Well, in a sense, everything is, because, of course, all films and TV comes out of a very small number of studios, all of which have massive parent corporations, which have interests in every aspect of mining and arms and everything that you can imagine. So in that sense, corporate control is almost absolute. If we are talking about political control, as in the role of the Department of Defense, the CIA and other aspects of the national security apparatus, the FBI and so on, you're still talking about a relatively small number of films that are being affected at a script level. However, they are some of the most important films in terms of how we see American foreign policy. So every time you see a soldier on screen, there's a very good chance that that soldier has been put there by the military, by the national security apparatus. And that means that the script has also been, to some extent, controlled and certainly signed off on and agreed by usually the Department of Defense. Now, that means that our whole vision of the way that the world looks and our whole vision of the way that American policy is formed is quite heavily influenced by the government itself.
And is that reduced to a very simplistic good guys and bad guys? I mean, it is, right? Because ultimately you see the standalone hero who goes out there, saves the day. The system is then put back because the bad apple's been taken out of the system and everything can go on and functioning as normal. That's the Hollywood formula, right?
That is the Hollywood formula. I mean, I wouldn't say that always happens, because you end up having, sometimes the government may be seen, like there may be cynical elements within the government, say. Right. The classic example would be something like Rambo, where the government has basically betrayed the American soldiers in Vietnam. But of course, the ideological thrust, the kind of central thrust of that film is still, we need to go into Vietnam to kill everybody to get our missing soldiers.
Which again is purging bad and promoting good.
Yes.
So when there's consultation with, for instance, security services, CIA, FBI, whoever it might be, when did this start?
In terms of the Department of Defense, they started getting much more seriously involved in the creation of films during World War II.
Right.
And then the Pentagon was formed just after World War II, and so it became more formalised. The military, in some form or another, has been involved with creating films since the very inception of Hollywood. In fact, the first film that was even made was during the Spanish-American War, where you see, and it's a 30-second film, 1898, the Spanish flag goes down from its flagpole and the American flag goes up. End of film. 1915, there was military Home Guard support for the Ku Klux Klan movie Birth of a Nation. So there's been this kind of troubled history that's gone on for over 100 years. But the sort of formalisation of that relationship really is post-World War II. And then the CIA is a bit peculiar, really, because the CIA, despite being very good at using intelligence, using manipulation, actually wasn't that involved in the manipulation of films until the 1990s. Now, I don't want to exaggerate that, because actually the research that myself and Tom Secker did for our last book shows that the CIA was actually quietly involved in making quite a few films in the 1950s and also stopping films being made.
Right. So this is
kind of important.
But that's the key point, isn't it? Because we can talk about what's been made because it's out there and you can see it and you can break it down and put some critical thought to it. It's what is being left unsaid, and it's what's being blocked and what's being censored.
Yeah, and that sort of happens as a matter of routine, although to call it censorship is a slight leap, because, of course...
What is it, then?
You could call it quasi-censorship or whatever.
Right.
You know, I'm a bit suspicious of the words like censorship and words like propaganda in the same way that I'm suspicious of words like conspiracy theory, because they all come with lots of loaded additional meanings to them. But the CIA during World War II, its forerunner, the OSS, helped create 3 films, and the leading historian, very sober historian, Simon Wilmot's, who is less, certainly Tom and I think that there is more CIA involvement than Simon was suggesting. But he was saying, look, if it hadn't been for those 3 films, you probably wouldn't have even had the CIA. You wouldn't have had the existence of the CIA without those movies in World War II being created to heroise the OSS, the forerunners of the CIA. But then it wasn't particularly involved in filmmaking in terms of actually creating films, but it did keep its name out of films. So one of the first times that the CIA is even mentioned, bearing in mind it was formed in the late 1940s, the first time it was even mentioned was in Dr. No, the first James Bond film in the early 1960s.
Felix Leiter, Central Intelligence Agency. You must be James Bond.
So for about a 10 or 15-year period, it was effectively, as an institution, able to keep Hollywood just quiet, along with a few little films here and there where it was sort of not mentioned, but, you know, with a little bit of good PR spin on the side. And then there was a problem, because there was all sorts of nightmare things that happened in American foreign policy in the 1960s and 70s. One of them was the Bay of Pigs disaster, which a terrible invasion of Cuba that went wrong, and the CIA was blamed, and Kennedy was involved, and it was all a big mess. And then there were a series of huge intelligence leaks and investigations into what the CIA had done. 1975 became known as the Year of Intelligence. Yeah. And basically the government was turning in on itself and saying, what the hell is the CIA doing? You've been spying illegal wiretaps on hundreds of thousands of people, particularly anti-war protesters. This is not a matter of security. This is a matter of spying on and manipulating your own people, propaganda. And so this led to the CIA saying, what can we do now? We can't stop doing all these things, really.
So they had to spin it.
But we have to start spinning it. They formed a much more efficient propaganda service within their own country, PR service. And then as an offshoot from that, that's when they started to become much more involved in Hollywood. And partly they also were encouraged by what the military was doing, because the military was so effective in terms of recruitment and PR and spinning the way that the United States was seen through a film called Top Gun in 1986, that the CIA realised that actually, rather than just trying to manipulate the news, which people like Woodward and Bernstein had demonstrated really clearly they were doing. They've got people all over every newspaper, every TV station, but they realised that it would be a really good move to do much more in Hollywood. And that's what they started doing in the early 1990s.
What sort of films were they involved with?
I mean, initially, when we first looked into this at the turn of the 21st century, you know, if you look at, say, IMDb, it looked like they'd been involved in sort of 3 things, like The Recruit, which was an Al Pacino movie that kind of sank into the water a bit, and a couple of other things. But actually, we found out just 2 or 3 years ago, just because the CIA just started to slightly open up a little chink, and then we realised that they were involved in whole series like 24 and Alias, and they were involved in many more films. And we realised they were involved in Charlie Wilson's War. And a lot of these things were... people kind of suspected maybe that there was, but there was nothing ever written down on paper. And even now with the CIA, because it's much more closed, we don't see the scripts and the annotations and the memos and the letters going back and forth. We would like you to change this, this, and this. It seems to be done a lot more on the sly. What
you're saying is that there's active script amendment from on high to ultimately push a certain narrative which ultimately fits in with American foreign policy, still.
Yeah, all the time. And more so now, because, in fact, that process has accelerated considerably in the last sort of 10 or 15 years.
Why?
Because the explosion of TV channels, the military in particular has said, let's get involved in TV much more. So they get involved in all sorts of things, including cookery shows and all sorts. Every time that there's a military person who's baking a cake or flying off into space or whatever it is, the military is going to be the people behind that. And they are going to want to have right to amend the script. The point is, it doesn't necessarily matter too much if it occasionally happens, this sort of thing, but it's the fact that it's systematic. If you look at this, what we could call a subgenre of action films, or a kind of genre to the side, if you like, we could call it national security cinema. And you're talking about several hundred products which are very prominent about the way that we view the entire geopolitical world and the way that we view our leaders. National security cinema comprises all of these movies, and also you could extend it to TV if you wanted, and to video games, of course. And they're usually worked on and edited by these quite secretive military organizations. And they're also promoting this line, which is that United States Western foreign policy is good, that there are official enemies that we should destroy. A lot of the time they've been Arab and Muslim enemies, not all the time, and there has been a small improvement on that over the last sort of 15 years or so, because they don't want to start a civilizational war, and they don't want blood on the streets, particularly between Christians and Muslims. But nevertheless, those kind of narratives are still pushed. But if you look at the context of that, and if you have got concerns about whether you trust Western foreign policy to do the right thing, then cinema is a really important part of creating that kind of facade to allow Western militaries to go in and really screw up a lot of these countries. I mean, I don't think there's many people who disagree that the last 17 years of American and British foreign policy has been pretty disastrous.
Total disaster.
Whether you're on the left or right.
Exactly. But the point on all this is the neocons have had a field day, in broad terms. I mean, as we look around the Middle East, most of it, as you say, has been a disaster. There are people watching this who think, I don't want to go to the cinema and be subtly manipulated, or the attempt at subtle manipulation. What do you say to those people, insofar as they've had enough of the jingoism?
Two things that you can do is, one, just make sure you don't go and watch anything that's been supported by the Department of Defence.
But how do you know? Because you know when the parental guidance the sticker comes up at the front that says, this is an 18 or whatever it is, it doesn't also say, and by the way, the CIA have been all over this.
No, but it obviously should do.
Yeah, but it's not going... I mean, that's going to be a push too far on the censorship side of things. So,
a lot of the very prominent films are supported by the Department of Defence. I mean, the CIA is a slightly different kettle of fish, but just for the sake of specificity, things like the whole Marvel series, like Captain Marvel, which is coming up, these are Department of Defence supported products. Now, that is the reason why they're a bit unsatisfying. They're made a bit boring by the fact that you've got the government involved in doing it. Why would that ever work? Why would that ever be as entertaining as it should be?
Can you imagine the British government?
Because it ruins the imagination.
Right. But can you imagine, I mean, if we think the Americans are bad, can you imagine the British government editing film?
Well, they'd make a complete hash of it, so that would be fine.
What, because it would be so obvious?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, the British have got a long involvement in propaganda as well, and even one of the early films that was made was George Orwell's Animal Farm, where the rights were bought by the CIA in the early 1950s, and then Animal Farm, which was an anti-system parable, was then turned by making some subtle changes to the ending of the film. It made it look like it was anti-socialist rather than anti-everyone, which is what Orwell's original intention was. Now, that came out from a British author, British involvement. If you're concerned about British and American foreign policy, then this is why you need to engage in this material. I think that the vast majority of the public are sick to death of military interventions, and they're sick to death of racist and xenophobic ways of approaching the outside world. And I think cinema is a part of that system, which does need to be changed if we're going to survive as a species, for a start.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc., the show that allows us to think differently. Before we talk more about Hollywood and its influence with Dr. Matthew Alford, let's have a look at what you've been tweeting about in this week's Renegade Inc. Index. First up, from R.A. the Rugged Man, I see Hollywood celebrities tweeting about propaganda, totalitarianism, believing lies. Meanwhile, they regurgitate and repeat all the same talking points as everyone else in their Hollywood echo chamber. They think they're above the brainwashing, but actually they're part of it. And next from Miranda, is Hollywood a political war tool? They sensationalise the battlefield, glorify the killing, popularise terror, and normalise occupation.
I think that's right, but I mean, at the same time, I don't want to simplify this message too much. I mean, look at the war films that have come out of Iraq, like The Hurt Locker, for example, or look at American Sniper, or look at the Vietnam War films like The Deer Hunter. Now, those films are harsh to watch. The thing is, they show the tragedy of war, which is one of the reasons that they work. They have proper, really good human drama behind them. So in a way, I celebrate that. But at the same time, they're so consistently having this idea that we are in there for the right reasons, or at least we're in there for reasons that are so vague we don't even need to talk about it on screen. And then there's this kind of heroic aspect to it, and there's often a kind of racist aspect to it. It's the pernicious combination of all of those different aspects. You look at something like American Sniper. It is an interesting story of what happened to this person. But if you look at the background to it, this guy was a psychopath. And that's, to make a hero out of someone like that, is really disturbing and warped.
Next from Garkai Chengu, Hollywood war films like American Sniper are not so much works of art as propaganda designed to legitimise or glorify American militarism.
I think Hollywood is a richer thing than this. There is still anti-war films in Hollywood, and there are still anti-deep state films in Hollywood. I've got some good examples: Kill the Messenger, Shooter, Mark Wahlberg, Get Out, The Ghostwriter, The East. These are great examples of films that really do go against the grain there.
And finally from Rhiannon Needham, isn't it funny that in movies the bad guy is always foreign? They teach us to be afraid of Russian, German, Middle Eastern, etc. men, when the scariest man in the world right now is a middle-aged white man. This is all about fear of another, isn't it? Creating that fear of something else so you can control a population, if you like, within your own borders.
I completely agree, but actually think about an upcoming film called Vice, which is about a very scary middle-aged white man, Vice President Dick Cheney. And that looks like it's presenting him as a kind of sociopathic figure.
We talked to Jay Dyer about fear of another. Here's the clip.
You could probably go back to the time of H.G. Wells, who was one of the earliest propagandists who would basically paint anyone from Eurasia as this sort of monster beast-like creature that the holy forces of the West that represented freedom and liberty and democracy had to destroy the rest of these tyrannical forces. H.G. Wells was a master of propaganda, and many of the later propagandists would actually work on the basis of Wells. This is also why, by the way, Hollywood has relied so heavily over the decades on H.G. Wells, because it's such powerful propaganda. And even a lot of science fiction, believe it or not, is not just about aliens, but actually it taps into our fear of the other. It's about the fear of the alien forces in some other far-off land that we don't know about, Eurasia in 1984, right? So the reason that Hollywood has to do that is that it's a vital part of creating the demons in the American or the Western psyche, right? And this is essentially what was mastered not just in World War II with the psyops of the Germans, but in the Cold War. This brought this to the height of, with espionage and the Soviet Empire. You had to portray them as not a government, perhaps, that was corrupt, but as the entire race of some people that was corrupt.
We might think that this is new, but actually you can go all the way back to Plato with this. Plato's cave, the fear of the shadows on that cave wall. It's about controlling a people within your own borders, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the main enemy of any government is not anyone who's outside of that country. The main enemy of a government is its own people. And so they have to be controlled in that way. And that goes back in PR terms to people like Walter Lippmann at the beginning of the 20th century, who were talking about the manipulation, the manufacture of consent, because the people can't be trusted with their own, to make their own decisions or to have their own views.
And does this broadly come under this idea of, or the banner of, managing democracy?
Yes, it's about creating necessary illusions, as Chomsky puts it. There are these 5 key things that Herman and Chomsky talk about that determine what the media is going to be like. And that's the concentrated corporate ownership, the importance of advertisers, the role of the government as being a source, the ability of powerful forces to cause problems if you do go against the grain, and the kind of general sort of anti-communist pro-free market, we're the good guys sort of ideology as the fifth filter. Interestingly, that second filter about advertising does seem to be diminishing to some extent, at least in certain pockets of the media. In 2010, when I wrote that first book with Pluto Press, one of the things I said at the end is, let's get rid of those 5 filters as much as we can do, and you're going to end up seeing better quality entertainment.
Right.
One of the filters that they're, at least to some extent, getting rid of now is advertising.
But is that being superseded by product placement? Because, you know, if you look at the Bond franchise now, for instance, I mean, the product placement in it is phenomenal.
Yeah, it's incredible.
So advertising
tens of millions
is
of dollars just saved just through having a beer, you know, put into the right frame.
So what's happened is that the advertising model has morphed.
Yeah.
And it's become a lot more subtle. And actually, you have to be a lot more vigilant when you're watching it, not to be manipulated.
Advertisers are not very good at actually changing scripts. If they don't like the script, they just won't be involved in the first place. If the Department of Defense doesn't like the script, they will change it.
Right.
But with the advertisers, you know, they're either going to buy into the movie or they're not. They don't usually have a great deal of
So they're a lot more coarse, basically.
They're a lot more coarse, but in a sense, they're a lot
more honest.
They're more honest and they're less dangerous in terms of the actual ability to directly manipulate. What advertisers do as a whole is create this kind of saccharine culture where the movies that they make are going to be a bit cheesy and they're going to be a bit safe, and they're going to be creating this buying mood throughout the entire thing. So you're going to leave the cinema and you're going to want to buy an Aston Martin, or you're going to want to buy Gillette razors or whatever it is. So that's a kind of a bad thing, but it's a little bit different to creating propaganda products that are encouraging Western military intervention. So I don't particularly like advertisers, but at the same time, then I don't think they're as serious a problem as the national security apparatus.
Why, if Hollywood is such a font of creativity and original thinking, why so many remakes?
Well, they make money. That's the main thing. I mean, Hollywood isn't really there to as a war propaganda machine. That's not its intention. That's not the intention of most people who are there. It is there to make money for the stars and for the directors and for the producers and for the executive producers and for the studios and their parent companies. And they know that product placement will mean that they can save loads of money. They know that working with the Department of Defense will mean that they save loads of money. And they know that that remakes will make loads of money. In a way, that's our fault. I mean, you can't blame everything on the authorities. I mean, I'm very suspicious of the authorities, but we are the market.
It takes two to tango.
We do demand it.
How many actors know when they read a script? Do you know what? The Department of Defense have been all over this. Because I don't want to get it, because it's very easy, this bit, to get into conspiracy theory, to say, you know what, this actor is in the pocket of these people and he's doing this or she's doing this because... Do you think that they it's way more commercial? It's a good script. I'm going to do it. That's going to be the pay I'm going to get for it.
It's much more that. I mean, but I would say though that in terms of Hollywood figures who have worked very closely with the CIA, for example, people like Tom Cruise who have visited the CIA on several occasions, people like Ben Affleck who have visited the CIA, Dan Aykroyd. There's a whole list of people. They are not covering that up. But their involvement, their ties to that are much closer, I think, than many would suspect. And then there are some cases of where these Hollywood figures are actually quite directly working for intelligence organizations. So Aaron Milchan, for example, the producer of Pretty Woman, was working for Mossad for years. He admitted a few years ago to spying for the Israeli security and actually acquiring, I think it was the triggers that were necessary to build Israel's bomb in the 1970s, as in the nuclear bomb. So that's someone who's working as a producer and using that as a cover. And I think that his spy master was Shimon Peres, I think I'm right in saying. And then he said during that same revelation that Sidney Pollack, who had made The Interpreter, and Michael Clayton, I think, he said he was also very heavily involved as an intelligence asset. And he could say that because Pollack had just died. Incredible. So that kind of thing does happen.
Incredible.
Yeah.
We're adults and we can choose what we go and graze on, what we go and see. Children can't often because they are influenced by their peer group. It comes to a different sort of level of manipulation, doesn't it, when you start messing around with children's media and films that hit their consciousness. Where else have Hollywood been involved, CIA, Department of Defense, where else have they been involved when it comes to indoctrination, specifically towards children?
I mean, Marvel is the best example. Say the Superman film from a few years ago was Department of Defense supported, but we don't really know what changes were made. Again, it's one of those ones where the script hasn't come out. There's military involvement in characters like G.I. Joe and things like that, all of which are pitched to kids.
How do you inoculate yourself against these products? Is it just thinking critically? How do you do that?
I mean, that's the obvious answer, isn't it? Engage brain. People can, in general, separate fantasy from reality. It's fine to watch movies, silly movies. I mean, take the Lego movie. Like, it's the most advertising-saturated film you could ever imagine.
Yeah.
But it's hilarious, and it's a brilliant, funny film, and it's also a very subversive film.
We asked Jay Dyer the same question about inoculation and how one can protect one's mind against increasing gore and violence within the Hollywood studio system.
I think the best way to guard oneself from it is, for the most part, to unplug from it. I mean, I don't really do any of this stuff for the most part. I mean, I will watch films for the purpose of analyzing them. If I'm going to watch films, I'll watch a lot of older films that don't have a lot of the toxicity. A lot of people definitely should guard their children from this stuff, because that's the biggest way that this system has power, is by basically indoctrinating the youth. That's the main target here. It's not the people 30 and 40 and 50 and over. It's the youth. So that's the main thing to guard against this, is to protect children.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in terms of military recruitment. I mean, I suspect you'll see that again with Top Gun 2 when it comes out.
The glorification of...
Not just that, but actually, in the first film, it led to an increase by the government's own estimate, of a 300% increase in the interest in joining the military. And that's partly because they had recruitment booths actually in the cinemas at the time. And of course, they do this for lots of products, but I suspect that will happen again with that sequel.
That's incredible.
I don't think anyone should panic about Hollywood films. I just think you should be aware that there is this big block of people who are part of the military-industrial complex who are working on some of the key products within that system. And if you don't like national security approach to the world by the United States and by our own security services in Britain, then just be aware that there is a big block of movies out there that are doing that.
Matt, thank you very much for your time. That's it from Renegading HQ this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegading.com, or you can tweet us @Renegading. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.